this.
Well done.
I'm telling you, I'm learning a lot today.
You're knocking it out of the ballpark.
Okay, we have 1 minute to start, 1 minute to go, and then we will go from there. Oh my gosh, I cannot believe that, like literally about 10 minutes beforehand, my computer just started rebooting on its own, and I'm like, no, not now. But we're gonna do it. I bet you my computer comes back up after this is over. One minute, less than.
Oh, Brian said something about the captioning not working. Is he saying that it's working now?
Is it working? Yeah, I think it's working. Those were previous comments, right?
Okay.
Okay, it is 1:00. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, I want to say thank you to those of you whom are our panelists today, as well as those whom are chiming in to be a part of this with us today. I want to say good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shantae Nelson, and I am the state director with All Voting is Local, which is a campaign of the Leadership Conference Education Fund. We are so pleased to host this event today to discuss our latest report. Basically, the report's name is Getting There is Half the Battle, Wisconsin's Photo ID Law, accessing the DMV Services, and the fight to our freedom to vote. Joining us today, of course, is myself, as well as Barbara Beckert from Disability Rights of Wisconsin. She is the Milwaukee Office Director. We have Eileen Newcomer from the League of Women Voters. She is the Voter Education Manager. And we have Alex Corona from Milwaukee LGBT Community Center. She is the Transgender Program Coordinator. First, I'm going to provide some opening remarks about top-level findings within the report, as well as just provide a little bit of background. And then I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Beckert, who will speak about some of the limitations that are faced by those with disabilities as it relates to access to DMVs. And then followed by Barbara will be Eileen. She will talk about barriers to language access as for non-native English speakers within Wisconsin. And we will conclude with Alex, who will share her story on how the system can better support trans Wisconsinites. The speakers will be available to answer questions during our question and answer section following the remarks. And I will also share at this time that we do have closed captioning available. If you need to see closed captioning because it's not showing up on your screen currently, if you would select the CC at the bottom of your screen, and you can choose between show subtitle or view transcript. So I want to make sure that you have that information, and we will go from there. So without further delay, here are my remarks. Most of us truly believe that for democracy to work for any of us, it must include all of us. And so at the core of this particular belief, there is a very important factor, the need to protect the right to vote and protect and expand our freedom to vote. No matter where we live within the state of Wisconsin, access to DMV and DMV locations is needed in order to obtain an ID. And not only just obtain an ID, it is critical to daily functionality. So in Wisconsin, we all understand that the DMV service centers are the primary place where constituents can obtain an accessible photo ID. But if we cannot access this DMV service centers, then we have a limited ability to really have access to the ballot. So this particular report, done in collaboration with the Disability Rights of Wisconsin and the League of Women Voters, will highlight and focus on DMV accessibility, as well as photo ID for voting. We understand that voters face a number of barriers when it comes to planning to vote. And from those barriers can include understanding the laws around photo ID. They can include residency requirements and simple things like transportation to polling locations. So it is important for us to know that when so many barriers to accessing the ballot are there, and then we add on the challenge of confusion to DMV services related to photo ID, as well as limited hours to DMV locations, as well as limited locations as a whole, we can assure that voters will have limited engagement when it comes to the process. So the release of this report is important because we truly believe that DMV access is what's needed when we talk about creating a way, or dismantling, if you will, the challenge of where marginalized individuals have to work so much harder to make their voices heard and get to the ballot box. And we will, like I stated, talk about things like limitations that are created when hours and locations are limited. We'll talk about the challenges to non-native English speaking voters and individuals. And we will talk about and highlight some of the things that are a challenge for not having the appropriate documentation as it relates to DMV services and being able to obtain a photo ID. So the report, those of you, we can also share it, but it will include some recommendations for eliminating some of these barriers, and we ask that you would help us to lift those up. So we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Beckert.
Thank you so much, Shantae. I'm Barbara Beckert with Disability Rights Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition. And we are really gratified to be a partner in this important report, because so many Wisconsinites with a disability experience barriers to voting, and including lack of acceptable photo ID as one of the most significant barriers. The right to vote is a cornerstone of our democracy. People with disabilities who call our hotline treasure that right to vote. But far too often, we hear from voters about the barriers they are experiencing that prevent them from casting a ballot. And lack of photo ID is a major barrier. For a lot of people, having a photo ID is something they take for granted. Everyone has one, right? Wrong, that's not correct. The most common form of photo ID for voting is a driver's license. Many people with disabilities do not drive. They don't have a driver's license, and many do not have other acceptable photo IDs. In our experience on the hotline, most of our callers don't have a US passport, a military ID, a tribal ID, or student IDs. Those are the other acceptable photo IDs for voting. So while a free ID for voting can be obtained at the Department of Motor Vehicles offices, if you're a non-driver, access to DMV can be a formidable challenge. Accessible transportation is consistently the top concern for people with disabilities in Wisconsin. Many people with disabilities have very limited access to transportation, especially accessible transportation. In most of rural Wisconsin, there is not widespread public transit, and paratransit access is also very limited. A lot of the voters who we talk to are on a fixed income. A ride to DMV to obtain a photo ID is not funded by Medicaid or other state transportation programs. Volunteers play an important role in providing transportation, but they don't have lift-equipped vehicles, so they're not usable for people with mobility disabilities. Of the 80 permanent DMV service centers in Wisconsin, only 23 open Monday through Friday, and only 7 operate on Saturday. If you're a non-driver and counting on a friend or family member to provide transportation, good luck. The limited options for evenings and weekends are really going to limit your options to get a ride from friends and family who may be at work during the day. Access to DMV is especially difficult in rural areas where many DMV locations have limited hours. A long commute of 40 minutes or more each way adds to the access challenge. Just to share a few examples from our partners in Western Wisconsin. In Dunn County, the Menominee Service Center is only open on Monday and Wednesday from 5 to 7. It's at least a 30-minute commute each way for some to access. In Clark County, the Abbotsford Service Center isn't even open. It's closed now. And the Neelsville Service Center has very limited hours, Tuesday to Thursday from 7 to 5, and at least a 40-minute commute each way for some to access. So those are some of the barriers for folks with disabilities and other voters in Wisconsin. We welcome this report because it provides constructive recommendations for our policymakers to take action and expand options for obtaining photo ID. This could include improving DMV access by expanding hours, including adding evening and Saturday hours, co-locating state ID operations at locations that are already accessed by people with disabilities and older adults, such as aging and disability resource centers or income maintenance offices. We also think it's important to have a plan to assess and address the physical accessibility of DMV offices to ensure they meet ADA accessibility standards, both programmatically as well as the physical plant. And finally, expanding the photo ID options for voting purposes to be inclusive of non-drivers. The options we have here in Wisconsin are extremely limited. It's worth giving another thought and seeing if we can expand them. The time to act is now. We are really encouraged at DRW by the work that the Department of Transportation is doing to address the needs of non-drivers, as well as initial efforts by the administration to take action to expand access. So let's work together to address these barriers so every eligible Wisconsinite can take part in our democracy. I'll turn it back over to Shantae, and happy to answer questions a little later in the program.
Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate that. We are going to hand it right over to Eileen from the League of Women Voters.
Hi, everyone. And I want to say again that, I've been saying this, several times, but the League is so grateful also to be part of this effort and to be part of this report discussing the barriers that people face and, just lifting up the real life challenges that people face when trying to get what they need in order to vote. And we know it's crucial that every eligible voter is able to access their right to vote. And with the photo ID law in Wisconsin, it's important to remind folks that acquiring a driver's license or a traditional state ID requires voters to provide documentation beyond just proving their identities. And many people have difficulty accessing all the documents that are required to prove their citizenship status, prove their names and dates of birth, prove their Wisconsin residencies, provide their social security number, prove any name changes, and prove their identities. And all this documentation can be costly and cumbersome to gather. And for Wisconsinites who have changed their names, for example, married or divorced women, transgender people, those who have gone through the adoption process, among others, they have to jump through additional hoops to provide that additional documentation to prove their name changes. And the state does recognize that documentation can be a barrier to getting an ID to vote and has instituted the ID petition process, where the DMV helps track down documents so folks can get an ID for voting. However, this process doesn't work for everyone. Less than half of the petitions have been resolved, meaning that the voter was issued a photo ID that lasts longer than 60 days. And for some, the required documentation is not just difficult to find, it's impossible to find because it never existed in the first place. And these documentation related barriers are compounded for folks for whom English is not their first language. And one of the items that we highlight in the report is the reality that hundreds of thousands of Wisconsinites do not speak English as their first language or have significant disabilities that require reasonable accommodations to communicate. There's a significant gap in the availability of resources in other languages or information on what accommodations the DMV is prepared to provide, let alone ensuring that these are culturally competent resources for those who need them at the DMV centers across the state. And I do want to lift up one of the stories that we highlight in the report. This was shared with us by Celie, and she talked about her experience helping her parents navigate government processes by serving as an interpreter for her parents at the age of as young as 7 years old. And I do want to, just highlight and mention that, like, our government should not be relying on children to translate for their parents so that they can get the required ID to participate in our electoral process. And I, want to be clear, ensuring voters have access to a photo ID is not solely the job of the Department of Transportation. We're calling on the Department of Transportation, the governor, and the legislature to make common sense steps to mitigate the discriminatory impact of the voter ID law. That concludes my prepared remarks, and I'll pass it back to Shantae.
Thank you, Eileen. I appreciate that. Thank you for your comments. At this time, we are going to turn it over to Alex Corona, who is from Milwaukee LGBT Community Center.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Corona. My pronouns are she, hers. I am the Milwaukee LGBT Community Center's trans program coordinator and communications liaison, and I'm so happy to be here and to have been called on to contribute to this report and also help spread the message and the recommendations made in the report as well. I'm so excited to be a part of this awesome team of people and kind of learn from them. And Eileen, I think your cat was agreeing with us, and I'm super excited about all of the potential for what this means for us. And I think I like the order that we all talked about, because these kind of marginalizations and these identities that make it more difficult, these barriers, the farther we get away from being like an able-bodied, cisgendered, white, heterosexual person, it gets harder and harder for us to be visible and for us to participate in the basics of democracy. And we can kind of see that this is kind of compounded when you add in identities that kind of make it harder to exist in the world. So we have people with living with disabilities, we have people who are living with different kind of citizenship statuses, and we have people in my community who are gender diverse or gender expansive. And even you can have everything together and you can have everything jump through all the hoops and make it through all of the verifications and all of the processes and have your ID and get everything done. But the worst part is that you can still be turned away at the polls. So if we are able to do everything, pass all the barriers, get everything we need, if our presentation doesn't match what we look like on our ID any longer, we can be turned away and we can be, our voice can be silenced. So we have to decide, do I show up as me, or do I have to have my right to participate in this voting process granted? So there's really kind of more difficulties, more barriers. A lot of people are shunned away from the voting process because they feel like they are not seen, they're not heard. And I guess when we even do represent or get representatives, they do not have our best interests in mind. This is, these kinds of complications are like increasing for trans folks across the country at an alarming rate. There have been more anti-trans legislation passed this year in 2021 than in the last 10 years combined. Just last week, Wisconsin had hearings making it, starting to start the process of banning trans people from participating in sports from the K through college level. So this is real fears. These are real things that are happening to make us invisible. So this is not just us shouting aimlessly. This is us voicing our needs and voicing to be heard and voicing to participate. Not asking for extra rights, we are asking for the same rights that everybody else is granted. So we are more than happy to sign on to all of these kinds of recommendations and to bring our perspective to these things. And also, when we're talking about access and access to voting, the Diverse and Resilient is an organization in Milwaukee. They recently did a report on the trans and needs assessment. And they said 85% of trans people rely on the bus to get from place to place. but only 25% of those trans people feel safe on the bus. So even if they had a free ticket, even if it was a free bus ride, even if it was accessible, do we feel safe? Do we feel like we are actually seen? Do we feel like we can go into a polling place and not be sirred or ma'amed or misgendered or scorned at? And so it's my pleasure to sign on to these, to continue pushing our legislators and all of our policymakers to include us in these conversations. I saw comments of other groups that should be included in these conversations, and they absolutely should, because we need to start not asking for things, but we need to start taking up our space and taking up our place in these kinds of positions. So thank you very much for having me. I'm going to pass it back to Shantae. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alex. We appreciate your comments, your experience, and all of your wisdom that you shared. Thank you to all of our panelists whom are here. Now we're going to open it up for questions. You can type your questions directly in, or I would say raise your hand and I would unmute you. My challenge with that is, for those who don't know, my laptop literally crashed right before this, so I'm doing this from my cell phone. So if you want to, I can help to try that, but we just may need to be a little bit lenient today, and that's okay. So I'm going to flip over to see if I see any questions, because it's different on the cell phone than a laptop. And then we will allow for questions and go from there. And for any of the panelists, if you've seen questions maybe that have popped up that I've not seen, please feel free to read them out, and then we can just go from there.
Yeah, Shantae, I can help maybe facilitate by asking questions, and
Cool.
then panelists can respond, and I'll jump into if I have a response. One of the things isn't a question, but I think there's a question in there, and it's kind of wondering about whether or not we have considered partnering with USPS or trying to work with them to make getting an ID more accessible, because there are so many of them located in the communities.
We have not necessarily partnered with USPS. I think it is a great idea. I know currently with USPS, once you submit a change of address form, I believe they provide you with an opportunity, or at least information about registering to vote. So not necessarily an opportunity. I think they may link you online to the My Vote website, but if not, they'll provide you with information around registering to vote. And so that is a really great idea. So thank you for whomever that was that asked that question. I'm not sure if you all work with USPS, Barbara, Eileen, you don't.
This is Barbara. I would just add that we are seeing a lot of challenges right now with USPS, with their capacity being significantly reduced, very long lead time for people's absentee ballots, for example, to be returned. So I really feel from the voters that we work with, we are hearing a loss of confidence in USPS. And I know that we saw a significant reduction in their capacity prior to the November election. So, in a philosophical way, it might make sense to look to them to take on this kind of responsibility, but it feels that they have significantly cut back their capacity. So I'm not sure that they have that capacity to be a partner on that front right now.
Thank you.
One thing that I just would add to, kind of going back to some of the recommendations in the report, one of the recommendations is that we ask the DOT to look for partners to co-locate services. Correct. So that might be a partnership to explore. I don't know how it works between a federal entity and a state entity, but that might be something to explore. I also see a question in the chat about how public libraries can help with this effort. And that's also something that comes to mind, is maybe offering to co-locate services, or just providing information generally on the photo ID requirements and about the ID petition process as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are always opportunities, if nothing else, even if we are, or an organization or an entity or an agency is unable to implement an entirely new process to provide information, is extremely grateful. It is extremely helpful for residents, especially when there is accessibility to those entities currently. So I 100% want to just kind of second and lift up that suggestion to maybe provide IDPP information, provide information around photo ID, provide even locations of DMV services that are open and the hours being available at some of these other entities would be beneficial as well. Anyone else? Other than that, we can, Eileen, if there are other questions.
Yeah, there's more questions. One of the questions is whether this report and the recommendations from the report is coming from people in Wisconsin or if it's coming from a national organization. And I can chime in with my thoughts, and then please everyone else chime in as well. This is a local Wisconsin effort. I know a lot of us do have national affiliates, but we are the local representatives and represent grassroots local people here in Wisconsin and things that they are saying that they want. The stories that are included in the report are from people in Wisconsin talking about real barriers that they faced. And I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on that one.
I'm a real person. I'm just a constituent. I was tapped because I do have a role in a community center in a nonprofit, but I'm speaking on behalf of me. I'm speaking on behalf of my real experiences, going to the poll and being misgendered and having that incongruency tried to be a barrier for me voting. So I'm speaking from my own personal perspective.
Thank you. Barbara, would you like to respond? And then I'll go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Shantae. Disability Rights Wisconsin is a statewide agency. We do have a voter hotline and we provide assistance to voters all over the state, including people who are having challenges with the DMV. And in addition to that, also working with the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition with agencies from around the state. I saw that there was that a follow-up question about the legislation proposed by the legislature? I'm not sure.
And if I can just chime in, Barbara, before to the next question. I know that all voting is local. We are a local organization. We have a national base. I, Shantae Nelson, have been in this work in Wisconsin doing this work for a number of years. And so I am very vested within Wisconsin. All voting is local is very vested within Wisconsin as well. So much so until we have partnered with a number of organizations here to ensure that we are keeping the work that is done within Wisconsin being done from the perspective of the people of Wisconsin. And so just wanted to make sure that all of the organizations on here were representative, we're able to voice our representation of Wisconsin being our home.
It looks like Don had kind of a follow-up clarification about the legislation. I'm going to assume the voting legislation that's currently in the legislature, and maybe where those bills are coming from. And Barbara, not to put you on the spot, but maybe you would like to speak to that briefly?
Sure. Thank you. So Don, I'm not sure if you want to clarify if your question was about the voting bills that are in the Wisconsin state legislature. There are a number of bills that have been circulated. Some have already been voted on in the Senate floor, and we're expecting more of them to be coming up soon in both the Senate and Assembly. And we've been concerned that a number of those bills would make it more difficult for people of color, voters with disabilities, and older adults to vote. And they have a particular focus on making it harder to absentee vote. So happy to address any specific questions, or Don, if you had in mind some other legislation, let us know and we'll do our best to address that. But in the meantime, encourage people, if you're interested in more information, I'll give a link in the chat to the Disability Vote Coalition website where we've got more details about the bills.
Thank you.
Another question is looking for more information about the ID petition process and how that works. And I'm happy to, again, to take a stab at this. And if anyone wants to fill in, please do chime in. But this is a process for people to get a free ID for voting purposes. And it's for people who maybe don't have access right now to all the documentation that they would need to get a driver's license or a state ID. So what people do is they have to go to the DMV. So it's something you can start online. You have to go in person to the DMV. But they show up, they say they want to go through this process. They bring whatever documentation they do have, and then they fill out 2 forms and start the process with the DMV. From that point, the DMV staff will work with their connections with other government agencies, whether in state or out of state, to help track down the missing documentation, so that people can get hopefully a physical ID that has a longer expiration date. In my mind, it helps me to think of it as a more permanent ID, but it lasts for 8 years rather than 60 days. So in the meantime, while the DMV is tracking down this information, the voter is mailed a temporary kind of paper receipt ID that they can use for voting purposes. It expires every 60 days. While people are in this process, their receipt is supposed to auto renew every 60 days until they get the longer ID, but there are different reasons of why the petition would be canceled or denied. Sometimes the DMV needs additional information from the voter, and this can require multiple conversations and follow-up conversations with the DMV. So that we do find that there are some people who are just kind of in the loop of constantly getting this the receipt, or there's just a lot of communication that it maybe is needed, and then they get denied because they don't follow up in time. So I hope that is helpful for explaining more about the ID petition process. Also, when you get a driver's license or some sort of documentation from the DMV, previous documentation, so like a out-of-state driver's license or state ID card, is then invalidated. And so there are reasons why people who maybe consider their residence in another state for non-voting purposes, but for voting purposes, they consider their residency Wisconsin, they may want to retain their out-of-state driver's license or state ID for those other purposes, but then still need an ID in order to vote in Wisconsin. And some concrete examples that come to mind are students, especially people who are here for school, and they live out of state and they want to retain their driver's license from their home state, but they would want to vote in Wisconsin, and that is allowed. And similarly, older retired folks in Wisconsin who maybe are snowbirds and they go to Arizona every winter, but they still want to retain their residency in Wisconsin for voting purposes. So those are just a couple examples. And if anyone else wants to chime in, please do.
I'm not going to chime in, but there are 7 questions in the Q&A section that have popped up, and I don't have any jurisdiction to speak on anything, but I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Alex. All right, are you able to see the Q&A? I can see them. If not, Eileen.
I can see them.
Okay.
And
really
if you
quick,
want the reins, though, that's fine too.
No, I don't mind either way. So I don't know if we got to Cecilia's question. I see that her hand is raised, but I'll read the first question. DMV needs a birth certificate. I don't know if this is a question, but I encountered a disabled woman who would need to go to Dunn County from Dunn County to Hudson to try to get a copy of her birth certificate. Yeah, that's a real life example of how challenging it is. I'll share this really quickly. Because I wanted to know very intimately, if you will, how challenging it could be from a transportation perspective, I actually drove to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and I wanted to find the closest DMV on a Saturday. The closest DMV on a Saturday was in Greendale, Wisconsin. And so it took me about 40 minutes and about $22 in gas. And I'm in a vehicle to drive from Kenosha to the Greendale DMV location, which if I were an individual who lived in Kenosha and I maybe worked during the same hours the DMV location in Kenosha was open, then I would have to find a way to get there on a Saturday, and it could easily take me between 32 and 40 minutes and about $22 in gas to get one direction to the DMV, and then I'd still have to do my business, turn around, and then come back. So this is something that is real for Wisconsinites, and it really does impact Wisconsinites in a real way. Just looking at the other question. So I see the question about what we need to do to make changes. I'm going to, we can share some things now, but I think that would be a really good way to close out as well. But we can share some things now. So some of the things that we talked about was it just expanding some of the services, right? Expanding some of the DMV access, some of the DMV service locations. We talked about co-locating some of these locations. We talked about allowing for DMV services to be open, having extended hours and Saturday hours 60 days prior to an election. I'm not sure if anyone else I don't want to hog up, but some of the things that can be done, of course, we can always, find ways to make this more accessible through finding ways to where structurally accessibility is there for Wisconsinites as well. Barbara, were you going to say something?
Yeah, thank you, Shantae. This is Barbara. So a few ideas about what those of you on the call today might be able to do. First of all, I'd encourage you to take a look at the report and share it with your state legislators, your assembly representative and senator. Let them know that this is something that's important to you and that you want them to take action. And you might call out a couple of the recommendations that are specific to the legislature. You could write a letter to the editor to give this issue more visibility. And you might also, if you have any local media who might be interested in it, share the report with them and encourage them to do a story on your local radio station, for example. And it might be something that you'd like to talk about, or any of us on the call would be happy to be a resource as well. So I think we've got to give a lot of information out there to make this more visible. I did put a link to the report in the chat. I see someone had asked about that, and I can do that again if it's not coming up. So
thanks, Barbara.
I have a couple additional, sorry, Barbara.
No,
I have a couple additional suggestions to add to. One of the things that you can do is join groups like, I know probably a lot of league members are on this call, but you can join groups like the league. There's the Voter ID Coalition, which is a statewide coalition, and they look for regional kind of experts to help people navigate this process and offer rides to the DMV and help be kind of an advocate to help people who don't have a driver's license or don't have a driver's license or don't have an ID in order to vote. So that's one concrete thing that you can do. As Barbara said, speak up, let your legislators know how you feel about the photo ID law, and maybe is in support of some of these recommendations that we have. I also think just generally talking to people in your community about the barriers that that people face in order to get a photo ID in order to vote. I mean, the fact is that this law, the photo ID law, is pretty popular, and people who have had a driver's license for as long as they can remember, maybe didn't experience the same barriers that other people face, or don't remember what it was like when they went to the DMV to get their driver's license. And so I think just helping let people know about the experiences of what other people face it would also be very helpful.
Thank you, Eileen. If I can, Eileen, I'm gonna ping you just one more time. I just realized how close the Q&A is to the end button on my phone, and I don't want to hang up by mistake. So if you can just read the questions that are in the Q&A for me, and we can all chime in.
No problem. The next question is about, says Walgreens does passport photos. Is there any way to link that with getting a photo ID?
That is a good question. I'm just thinking, so Walgreens will do the passport photo, but you still have to go through the United States Postal Service in order to obtain a passport. And I believe you have to, try to remember once I got my passport, I think you have to do your birth certificate and your social security card through USPS in order to obtain a passport. They actually retrieve that information from you, mail it with your application, and then they mail those documents back to you at a later date. So I'm not sure how that process may work, but we are absolutely open to all ways of being creative. It may end up being in a situation where we have to link back to the United States Postal Service, mainly because I don't know from a state statute perspective if Walgreens could be a partner specifically for photo ID. We know that DMV service centers are the primary location to obtain a photo ID in Wisconsin, and it may require some legislative changes in order to allow a third party, really an organization, to have authority to provide photo IDs within Wisconsin. So not sure if that is possible, but please continue to provide your suggestions.
Another question is if we can do pop-up vaccination events, why can't the DMV do pop-up voter ID events?
That is a really good question. I have stated asked a very similar question myself. We responded as a nation, but I'll just speak on behalf of Wisconsin. I think we responded fairly as quick as we could, let's put it that way, around vaccinations and the ability to vaccinate Wisconsinites. And so that is a question. I'm not sure if anyone else, any of the other panelists want to share their perspective there, but it's a realistic question.
So this is Barbara. The DOT does have some equipment that they will, on occasion, move to other locations. For example, in advance of the November election, we had advocated with DOT to expand the locations where people could obtain photo ID, particularly to offer more evening and weekend hours. And as part of that, they did open a temporary location on the south side of Madison, and they moved equipment and staff there to provide some increased access. So a lot of it is about having, as I understand it, is a budgetary issue. I think from what we've heard from some of the discussion with DOT, and in fact, their staff went over some of the recommendations with us in a recent meeting, is that they're very open to expanding things and having satellite locations, but they currently don't have funding in their budget to do so. So there is some modest expansion proposed by Governor Evers in his budget. We would like to see even more significant expansion. So again, that's an opportunity, I think, for all of us as advocates who would like to see that expansion, to be in touch with our state legislators and to make the case that this is needed now.
And I just want to say that I think it's a wonderful idea. And one of the things that we have previously recommended in one of our post-election reports is the possibility of having like a DMV representative at polling places to help people begin the photo ID process if they don't have an ID and they're going to try and vote. So that's just something too that we have talked about and something that you can maybe bring up with your legislator. The next question is, how will the possible new Wisconsin voter suppression laws and affect the photo ID requirements?
This is Barbara again. So one area in which the photo ID requirement would be impacted is for indefinitely confined voters. Those are voters who, because of disability, age, or other health concerns, have difficulty voting in person, and they have designated to be permanent absentee voters and always receive an absentee ballot. And currently in Wisconsin law, indefinitely confined voters are not required to provide a photo ID. They can choose to do so, but if they don't have a photo ID or they have difficulty because of technology providing it, they have the option to instead have a witness verify that they are who they say they are, which serves the purpose, the same purpose as the photo ID. So one of the bills, there are two bills, SB 204 and SB 206, which would make changes to significantly limit the indefinitely confined voting statute. And one of those includes no longer allowing people to have the opportunity, if they didn't have photo ID, to instead meet that requirement by a witness affirming that they are who they say they are. There are some amendments under consideration, so it's possible that that could change. But we're alarmed by those bills and think that they could disenfranchise a lot of voters.
Next question is, does the report include recommendations for language to be in future voting rights bills, or suggest other types of ID cards that could be used / added to the accessible list of photo ID? And yes, the report does have some, pretty concrete suggestions of alternate IDs that could be added to the list. One of them is, a photo ID that's issued by any unit of government, whether that's state, local, county, federal, any accredited college or technical school without the strenuous requirements that are currently on student ID cards, and then also a employee ID. And there are others that other states use that could be considered as well, but those are just some ideas to expand access to voting. Another question is, do any of your organizations ever collaborate with political parties / partisan groups on voting rights initiatives?
I'll chime in here. All three of our organizations are organizations that are nonpartisan, and in many ways we do our work in a very nonpartisan way. And so when we collaborate with any organization, any group, any individual, we are working to ensure that we do not collaborate based on party lines. We are, like I said, nonpartisan organizations, so we don't necessarily align with partisan politics. We align with access. We align with availability to the people to create a democracy that works for everyone, which is the thing that we focus on. So to basically answer your question, our intention, our interaction with other groups is always C3. It's always from a perspective of nonpartisan collaboration.
The next question is, courthouses and post offices can process applications for passports. Why can't they be allowed to process for a photo ID? And I would say, so a passport or a passport card is an acceptable ID for voting. And so they can process certain documentation, but they can't process documentation for the Department of Transportation because they are separate entities. And part of the reason why we focus on access to the DMV in this report is because that's the most practical place where people who don't have a driver's license or a state ID card or a passport are going to be able to get a photo ID. The requirements to get a passport or a passport card are even more stringent than those for getting a traditional driver's license or state ID card. And so I just want to name that. But again, I do think that there are maybe some possibilities to co-locate or for the legislature to do some work to make it more accessible, possibly through the post office or the courthouse to get an ID.
Yeah, and I would like to chime in just because I haven't said anything in a while. So hello, everybody. And I agree with everyone that we need to make access a lot easier. And when we're talking about legislation, we're talking about state statutes. And we're talking about being nonpartisan. I don't have partisan ideals. I have getting things done ideals and making things better for my community's ideals. So there is a push to change the name change and birth certificate gender marker change laws in Wisconsin that I really am advocating for, and that will make things even more accessible when we can easily self-determine ourselves on our birth certificate like other states are doing, where we can be more self-determining in our own selves, which will be empowering for everybody. That will increase voter turnout. And so I'm advocating for the update of archaic state statutes around updating gender markers on birth certificates, which will kind of start that process and start to kind of like break down the old school traditional ways, like publication in a newspaper for name changes is not necessary any longer. And having to have sex change, that's the surgical sex change procedure, is the language in the state statute right now. That's embarrassing that we even have that language still in our state statutes. So I make recommendations for legislation. I make recommendations that are in line with the rest of these, and I don't have any partisan beliefs because I just want things to get better.
Thank you, Alex. Any more questions that you see, Eileen?
Yeah, I see two more. And I think Alex's comments, do answer this next question. So I think you kind of preempted the question, but I'm going to say it out loud anyway. And then Alex, if you have anything more that you want to add, or if any one of the other panelists want to add something, feel free to do so. Anyway, the question is, as someone who has to stay nonpartisan, how do you talk about access without seeming partisan, given all the restrictions making access limited?
Alex, would you like to share anything else?
Well, as we see from the national, federal level to our local level, that just because we maybe someone's beliefs line up with a party, does that mean that party has your best interests in mind and that they vote with your best interests in mind? So I don't feel attached to being on one side of anything. I'm attached to the issues and I'm attached to the community. So I am able to kind of like ride that line of like staying nonpartisan, keeping my boss is probably watching this to make sure that I stay in line, but my recommendations are from bettering my community, not from playing sides and not from the chess game of politics in this world. So I am really kind of like guided by morality of that I'm advocating for my people, not for a particular side. And I'm not interested in rallying on one side of things because both groups are needed to get things done. And we need to kind of have friends. None of them are friends, but we need to have people on both sides that we can actually get things done with. And with the anti-trans sports legislations, we had Republicans in these committees. Oh, sorry, I just cited myself. But we have people in both sides of these committees that can actually have an adult human conversation with actual thought and rationale. And so that is a lot easier to kind of bridge gaps and to get things done and to realize what's best for our state and our constituents. Because we're still, regardless of if we're trans, if we're queer, or if we're living with disabilities, or if we're undocumented, we're still humans, we're still part of the state, we still live here, we still contribute, we still demand representation, and we still demand to be part of this process. So that is my addition to that.
And I'll just chime in and say this as well. Just, I love where you left off. Just this whole component of humanity. I often say that in order to access DMV services, in order to, when you were thinking about a photo ID, we know that we're talking about a photo ID and accessibility to that photo ID for the purposes of voting. However, when we really think about the need and the use of an ID within Wisconsin, everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, many of us need an ID just to be able to have functional living within Wisconsin, functional living within just within society. And so at this point, yes, it's a voting a voting access or a voting freedom component, but it's more so a human right to be able to access something that should be available to all of us. And so I know when we talk about this work, we are very issues driven, issues based, and we advocate specifically around the issue, not necessarily leaning towards one party or the other. Eileen.
Yeah, I would echo what Shantae and Alex said. And from our perspective at the League, we're here to represent voters and empower voters and make sure that they have what they need to make their voices heard. I don't have a stake in who they vote for. I just want them to be able to vote and have their voices heard, because I know that that voting is how we share power in our country, and having representation is so important to make sure that we're all able to contribute and shape the world that we live in. And so for me, when voters are able to make their voices heard, like, that's the win. And for political parties, they want more power, and that's the win for them. And so we just don't have the same goals necessarily. And so I keep focused on my goal, which is empowering voters to make their voices heard.
Thank you. Any final questions? We are about 5 minutes to time.
There was one more question, although I think that this is a wonderful note to kind of close on. But the other question is, who decides where there are satellite locations for the DMV or potential pop-up events?
Well, I know the Department of Transportation will make the final decision, but as a constituent, you absolutely can get involved, you can engage, and you can make suggestions as to where those locations are, should be, and need to be. And I say that because very recently, I would say in the 2020 election, I particularly, but my organization worked with some local officials, not elected officials, local officials whom oversee our elections, to convey areas that we knew that there were a lack of polling locations. And did we get every area that we asked for? No. But they heard our voice. And so when you talk about engagement, we know that the Department of Transportation will be the ultimate deciding factor. However, you absolutely have the ability to say, hey, we need a location within this particular area. Barbara spoke earlier about how we worked with the Department of Transportation to advocate for expansion, and they ended up opening up a satellite site within the city of Madison. They also worked with the Department of Administration to reopen one of the locations here in the city of Milwaukee on a limited capacity because of our advocacy. And so we cannot necessarily guarantee that we're the ones who decide, but we can absolutely suggest that decision. So again, I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank you for being a part of this. Listen, you all, we did this even with a computer crash. Like, thank God for cell phones, right? I am very, very grateful for cell phones. And so we were able to pull this off. If you have additional questions, please feel free to contact myself, to contact Eileen, to contact Barbara, and I'll just say what my email is. It is shaunty@allvotingislocal.org. Shantae @allvotingislocal.org. And if the rest of you could type your email, if you would so choose to do that, into the comments. Please feel free to email us. If you want additional information, please feel free to email us. We thank you for being here, and we thank you for participating in this time with us. Have a great one, you all. Oh, before I go though, I'm sorry, I did not thank our captionist. I did not thank our interpreter. So thank you all as well. I know that I welcomed you all, but thank you all for being a part of this. We would not have been able to have this be so accessible without your service as well. So thank you.